What is happening, everyone? California's magazine ban may be closer than ever to collapse as one of the biggest legal fights in the country reaches a critical turning point. The right to own standard capacity magazines in California could potentially return within days. Before we go any further, here is something important. Are you subscribed? Because the information in this update could help keep you from unknowingly violating the law overnight. Make sure you hit that button. And now, let us break down this major development. Let us get into Duncan versus Bonta, the court battle that could finally destroy California's long-standing ban on standard capacity magazines. If you live in California, own firearms, or simply care about Second Amendment rights across the United States, what is happening right now is incredibly important. Here is the issue in simple terms. In 2016, California passed legislation banning magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. But it did not stop there. The law also criminalized possession of magazines that were legally purchased years earlier. Overnight, millions of responsible gun owners were put at risk of becoming criminals simply for keeping property they had lawfully owned. That is when Virginia Duncan, along with other California gun owners and the California Rifle and Pistol Association, took legal action. Their argument was straightforward. California's ban violated the Second Amendment rights of lawful citizens. Now, this is where things really began to intensify. In 2019, federal judge Roger Benitez ruled against California's ban, declaring it unconstitutional. For one unforgettable week, Californians were legally able to purchase standard capacity magazines again. That moment became famously known as Freedom Week. Thousands rushed to exercise their rights while they had the opportunity. But then, California appealed and the ban was quickly reinstated. Fast forward to today, and this legal war has reached an even more explosive stage. In 2022, the United States Supreme Court issued its landmark Bruen decision, completely reshaping how courts must evaluate gun laws. Under Bruen, states can no longer justify firearm restrictions simply by claiming public safety concerns. Instead, they must prove those restrictions are consistent with America's historical tradition of firearm regulation. And that creates a serious problem for California. Why? Because broad bans on standard capacity magazines have little to no historical foundation in American history. After Bruen, the Supreme Court sent Duncan versus Bonta back down for reconsideration under this new legal standard. In other words, the lower courts were ordered to reevaluate California's law using the stricter Bruen framework. The case returned to Judge Benitez, the same judge who struck it down before, and in September 2023, he did it again. Benitez once more ruled that California's magazine ban was unconstitutional because it failed the Bruen historical test. His opinion made it clear that the Second Amendment protects firearms and accessories commonly used for lawful purposes, and standard capacity magazines unquestionably fall into that category. This was a major blow to California's defense. Then came another shocking development. In March 2024, a three-judge panel on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld Benitez's ruling. This stunned many legal observers because the Ninth Circuit has traditionally ruled against major Second Amendment challenges. But the battle was not over yet. California immediately pushed for an en banc review, meaning a larger panel of Ninth Circuit judges would reconsider the entire case. And just last month, that request was granted. Now Duncan versus Bonta stands at one of the most important crossroads in modern gun rights history. Here is why this matters so much, and why gun owners nationwide are watching closely. Many constitutional experts believe that after Bruen, and given the Supreme Court's increasingly strict view on Second Amendment protections, even the full Ninth Circuit may struggle to justify California's magazine restrictions. That means California's decade-long ban could truly be hanging by its final thread. If that happens, the consequences could be massive, not just for California, but for magazine bans and firearm restrictions across the country. This case could set a precedent that reshapes gun laws nationwide. So right now, all eyes are on the courts, because what happens next may determine whether millions of Americans regain rights that were taken away or face even more legal uncertainty. The boiling point is here, and this fight is far from over. And if the Ninth Circuit ultimately upholds California's ban, there is an extremely strong chance the United States Supreme Court will step in. And many experts believe it would likely strike the law down. Here is something surprising. About 73% of viewers watching right now still have not subscribed. Do not fall into that category. Join over 50,000 gun owners who stay ahead of these legal updates. Hit subscribe now because these major constitutional developments can change fast, and staying informed could make all the difference. Now let us talk about what this could mean directly for you. If you are living in California and currently own standard capacity magazines over 10 rounds, there is a real possibility you may soon be able to legally possess and use them again without fear of violating state law. If you purchased magazines during Freedom Week back in 2019, you may soon have stronger legal protection for owning and using them. And if you live in states like New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, Hawaii, Colorado, or Washington, places that also enforce magazine restrictions, this case could eventually have a serious impact on those laws as well. Why does that matter? Because once the Supreme Court issues a constitutional ruling, that decision affects the entire nation. This is not just about one state. Even if you live somewhere without magazine restrictions, this case still matters because magazine bans represent only one piece of the larger gun control debate. If courts continue allowing these types of restrictions, additional firearm limitations could follow. Today it may be magazines. Tomorrow it could involve broader firearm categories. That is why so many Americans are paying close attention. Now let us address one of the most common questions people ask. Why would anyone need a magazine holding more than 10 rounds? First, constitutional rights are not determined by need. The Second Amendment exists to protect freedoms. But beyond that, standard capacity magazines can play an important role in self-defense. Imagine being at home and suddenly facing multiple armed intruders. High-stress situations dramatically affect accuracy, even for trained law enforcement officers. Real-world defensive encounters often require multiple rounds to stop a threat effectively. Now consider facing several attackers while being limited to only 10 rounds. For many individuals, especially those with physical challenges, magazine changes may not be quick or easy. Take someone suffering from arthritis or hand weakness. Rapidly swapping magazines during a dangerous encounter could be extremely difficult. Restrictions can create very real disadvantages. But this case reaches beyond practical defense concerns. At its core, Duncan versus Bonta is about constitutional principle. It raises the question of whether government officials can selectively limit specific rights protected by the Constitution. The phrase "shall not be infringed" carries legal weight for a reason. Of course, it is important to remember that this discussion is educational, not personal legal advice. Anyone dealing with firearm laws should always consult a qualified attorney regarding their specific state and circumstances. So, what happens next? The Ninth Circuit's en banc review is expected to move forward within the coming months. Once that decision is issued, whichever side loses will almost certainly seek Supreme Court review. If the Supreme Court accepts the case, a final ruling could potentially arrive by 2026. But here is something many people overlook. You cannot afford to simply wait passively. Court rulings are critical, but public opinion, political pressure, elections, and the composition of the Supreme Court also play major roles in shaping constitutional outcomes. This legal battle is unfolding now, and the decisions made before January 2026 could have lasting consequences. That is why staying informed is essential. The next major update may directly affect how Americans protect their rights moving forward. Now, let us look at the broader constitutional picture. Duncan versus Bonta is bigger than magazines alone. This case is a major test of how Bruin will be applied across future Second Amendment challenges. Every successful case using the Bruin standard reinforces stronger protections for gun rights nationwide. For years, lower courts used balancing tests that often allowed judges to uphold gun restrictions they viewed as reasonable. Bruin changed that entirely. Now courts must focus on the actual text of the Second Amendment and whether historical traditions support specific firearm regulations. That creates a much tougher legal hurdle for modern gun control laws. And we are already seeing major effects since Bruin. Courts have challenged bans affecting 18 to 20-year-old adults, restrictions on homemade firearms, and even certain portions of federal firearm prohibitions. Duncan could add magazine bans to the growing list of vulnerable laws. When many legal analysts began fully understanding how powerful the Bruin framework could be, the potential impact became enormous. We may be witnessing one of the most significant expansions and restorations of Second Amendment protections in modern American history. And Duncan versus Bonta stands right at the center of this major constitutional battle. So while this case continues moving through the courts, what should you actually be doing right now? Here are the critical steps every gun owner should seriously consider. First, if you live in California and legally purchase standard capacity magazines during Freedom Week, make sure you keep solid records of those purchases. Save receipts, invoices, confirmation emails, anything that proves exactly when those magazines were legally obtained. That documentation could become extremely important. Second, stay updated constantly. Firearm laws can shift fast, and missing one major legal development could create serious consequences. That is why channels like this exist, to break down complicated legal battles into simple, understandable information without confusing legal jargon. Third, support the organizations actively fighting for these rights. Groups like the California Rifle and Pistol Association, along with other Second Amendment advocacy organizations, invest enormous financial resources into these lawsuits. These battles are expensive, lengthy, and critical. Without support, those legal fights become much harder. Fourth, vote carefully. The politicians elected today often influence judicial appointments tomorrow. Judges who interpret constitutional rights are placed on the bench through political systems, which means elections have long-term legal consequences. Fifth, educate others. Many Americans do not fully understand how magazine bans function, what they restrict, or why they raise constitutional concerns. Honest, calm, fact-based conversations with friends and family can help reshape public understanding over time. Information matters. Now here is the reality. A tremendous amount of time goes into researching these cases, tracking court decisions, and simplifying this information so everyday Americans can stay informed. So, if these updates help you, subscribing is one of the easiest ways to stay prepared for future developments while also supporting continued coverage, because these legal fights are far from over. Now, looking at the broader picture, something historic is happening. For decades, many courts treated the Second Amendment as though it carried less importance than other constitutional rights. That legal approach is now being challenged in a major way. The Supreme Court has increasingly signaled that the Second Amendment deserves the same constitutional respect as every other right protected under the Bill of Rights. And that shift could have enormous consequences for future firearm regulations. Have you ever stopped to ask why magazine bans are often politically popular? For many people unfamiliar with firearms, these laws may initially sound reasonable. But standard capacity magazines are not unusual or rare. They are standard equipment for many of the most commonly owned firearms in America. For example, a Glock 17 typically comes standard with a 17-round magazine. That is normal factory configuration. This raises a larger constitutional question. If the government heavily restricted commonly used components of another constitutional right, such as limiting pages in books or restricting digital communication tools, many Americans would immediately recognize the concern. That is why this debate remains so significant. As we reach the end of this discussion, one fact is becoming increasingly clear. California's magazine ban is facing serious legal danger. The outcome of Duncan versus Bonta could restore rights for millions, reshape firearm laws nationwide, and redefine how the Second Amendment is enforced for generations. This case is not just another lawsuit. It may become one of the defining constitutional battles of modern America. So stay alert, stay informed, and continue paying close attention because the next ruling could change everything. Be sure to subscribe, share your thoughts, and stay engaged. And remember, this information is educational, not legal advice. For personal legal concerns, always consult a qualified attorney. Thank you for following this critical update. Stay safe, stay lawful, and continue exercising your constitutional rights.